Well, Happy New Year and welcome to Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific, brought to you with the help of our friends at Bauer Group Asia. We'll tell you more about our sponsor in due course. It is I, the indubitable former military officer Ray Powell, and that's Jim Caruso, the seasoned diplomat and the one who actually knows what indubitable means. Jim, we are starting out 2025 without quite an impressive guest.
Yeah, we're very fortunate today to have Ambassador Rahm Emanuel with us. Ambassador Emanuel is one of those people who need no introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. So he was an advisor to Bill Clinton when he was in the White House. He was chief of staff to Barack Obama, congressman from Illinois, mayor of some town called Chicago on the lake, I hear, and is currently, for the past 2.5, almost 3 years, ambassador of the United States to Japan. Welcome, Ambassador Emanuel.
Some town called Chicago. Such an
from New York.
The East Coast. Yeah.
We want to keep you welcome and comfortable.
That's revealing.
I figure we might as well get the first shot. You'll get the rest. Anyway, so glad to have you with us. And let's just dive right in to the first question for our American audience, especially. Why should Americans care about the U.S.-Japanese alliance?
Well, I mean, there's not a reason. There's a series of reasons that add up. I mean, I start with the position that, and I hate using sports metaphors, but the Indo-Pacific is a home game for China. It's an away game for the United States. And to level the playing field, it's our allies that bring us closer in on the Indo-Pacific, just geographically, economically, culturally, politically, diplomatically, and from a security standpoint. And part of China's strategy is to be such a dominant power that they can determine the sovereignty and independence of any one country using every lever and every tool they have in the toolbox. And when the United States is in the theater and a permanent Pacific power and presence and perceived that way, that means there's no untethered China that can crush another country. And we're stronger and China's weaker when we have a multilateral system and they are the isolated party rather than the party isolating another country. It's kind of that simple. I don't mean to be that simple, but to put it in the most direct, concrete terms. And then when you think of the fastest growing economies in the world, Indo-Pacific, I think it's now or getting to be 40% of the world's GDP, if not higher. You have the 9th largest economy, which is Korea, the 2nd largest economy, which is China, the 3rd largest economy, which is Japan, and then the ASEAN countries that are fast and furious growing. Just take Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim country. So at every level, it is a dominant region of the world, and our allies make America stronger. There.
Speaking of America, making America stronger, Ambassador, we've seen quite a change in Japan's defense posture over the past few years. How would you summarize how, having been there in Japan, how that is viewed domestically in Japan? How do they feel about this change? And what has been the significance of that change?
Let me come right back to that. I want to deviate one thing because I think one of the conversations we have in America always puts deterrence on the level of how much metal you have. And I'll come back to that. I happen to think when the United States, Japan, and Korea, President Biden hosted everybody at Camp David, that was deterrence. When we have the United States, Japan, and the Philippines working together on Coast Guard and naval efforts, that is deterrence. And so that when you have the United States being a major energy supplier in the region, that is deterrence. So we actually have to redefine how we define deterrence and see it the way China sees it. They don't like all the political and diplomatic multilateral activity, and that adds a component to the credibility of our deterrence. Japan, to the core question and the core essence of the question, they obviously took a look at the world, and this is even before there's a Russian tank on the Ukrainian border. They call for increasing their defense budget to 2% GDP defense, which would take them from the 9th to the 3rd largest defense budget in the world. They are in the 3rd year of that 5-year buildup, and they will hit it. And it's a significant increase. Not only did they acquire Counter-Strike 450 Tomahawk missiles and capability, TLAMs, I would say if I'm doing this by memory, but over 96% of the defense increase is going purely to weapons and capability, not in the way that we kind of distribute our resources when we increase our defense budget. And they realize that the partnership and the alliance from a security standpoint requires Japan to be a much more significant player simultaneously, because they're making those changes and because we wanted to. And I say this is one of the first things I said, God, this has to change. And then realizing all the politics that has to change, it would never. And our military structure here is, in my view, an anachronism from a bygone era. We are now in the process of placing a command and control center here in Japan. Best way to think of it is taking functions and capabilities out of Honolulu, moving it into theater. We wouldn't have done that if Japan wasn't doing what they're doing. Part of their defense budget is to create, for the first time ever, a joint command operations center. And our command and control center, their joint op center, are going up simultaneously. So the integration is going to be, and this kind of synergy, I hate, again, using a business term, is going to be immense if done correctly. That's a big, significant change by both. And their investment in their own security leveraged a fundamental change that we never took on and should have done 20 years ago. And we're going to do it now. Admiral Aquilino, Admiral Paro have been brilliant in the way that they've laid out a plan. And Secretary of Defense Austin just been like a bull getting this done through the system. And it was part of his 2+2 announcement right after the state visit. We're going to go forward.
Ambassador, you mentioned that Asia is an away game for the U.S. And one of the things Ray and I had to deal with throughout our careers in Asia was basically them saying, yeah, it's an away game, and eventually you may go home. What reassurance can you give us that you'll here for the long term? So how do you answer that question?
Well, first, there's no reassurance. It's a work in progress. So if you're looking here for me to give you your blanket and your pillow, I'm not going to do it. I do think there are key pieces that anchor us here. One is that the largest military footprint by the United States in the world in a single country is here in Japan. After building that up over 70 years, you don't simply, out of flip of a switch, take it out. It's not that easy. One of the other second largest is in Korea. We're now investing in a level in Australia. These are kind of long tails, and you can't just remove them. That's on the military side. There's just for the largest, the number one foreign direct investor in the United States. About 1 million Americans work directly for Japanese companies, not considering the ancillary employment. They, of the G7 countries, almost 45% of their investment is in manufacturing and industrial. Massive, significant employer of manufacturing jobs in the United States. And it's not easy for the United States to end that and just pull out. Now, you have countries from India, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, the Philippines, Japan, and Korea, all very anchored in and around a U.S.-focused strategy of deterrence. The only ally China has in their contractual ally is North Korea in the region. All the other ASEAN countries, while they don't want to be caught between, they definitely do not, and that's, I get that, I can understand that. But what they don't want, between not wanting to be caught between the United States and China kind of energy that's moving in different directions, they definitely don't want an untethered China with no counterweight. That I can tell you, it doesn't matter what the political structure of that country is.
Ambassador, in your op-ed in the Washington Post last month, you talked about this concept that has been sort of making the rounds in U.S. foreign policy circles for a while, but we've really seen an acceleration in the last few years of this idea of an alliance and partnership lattice work. Can you explain what a lattice work is in these terms, and what's Japan's place in it?
No, the whole idea is to keep you in a fog. I can't do that. So, first of all, there's a lot of complaints. It's and there's rightfully complaints that our allies became so dependent on the United States, they kind of basically shrug their shoulder at their responsibility for the deterrence or for their own security, but more importantly for the collective deterrence. Truth of the matter is that I would say 80%, I don't know what the number is. There's X percent, it's north of 50. They are their responsibility, whether that's in Europe or here. Truth of the matter is when you look at kind of the way we conducted ourselves, we actually nurtured and fostered that dependence. So we're not exactly innocent when countries were doing not hitting the 2%, as NATO called, of GDP towards defense budget. The bulk of the responsibility is on the country. We're not exactly an innocent bystander complaining about it. We did complain about it, but some of the things we did fostered and nurtured a dependence that allowed countries to not actually invest in certain capabilities because they could always rely on the United States. That's true in Europe. It's true here. We're not innocent children in this situation. The multilateral, both military and political, so let's dissect them. Over the last 3 years, through IndoPACOM's leadership, there has been a tremendous emphasis on multilateral military exercises and training. Just last month, I did the Freedom Edge exercise in the Sea of Japan with Japan, the United States Navy, and the Korean Navy. We do real-time intelligence sharing between the United States, Japan, and Korea as it relates to activities, principally driven by North Korea. There are different exercises off the Philippines, off of Indonesia, Thailand, etc., that bring in both Indo-Pacific countries and European partners to participate fully out. That multilateral is exactly what China does not want to see. It's not only the capabilities, the skills that you develop, it means that there's many countries with a vested interest in the outcomes here in the Indo-Pacific. Then you take it onto the platforms of the political and diplomatic area. It makes China's strategy of isolating country A and using their economic, political, and security threats to crush their independence and sovereignty all that harder. We did a study of the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and Lithuania when China approached and used economic coercion because they didn't like what Australia said about COVID, or they didn't like what Lithuania said about Taiwan, or they didn't like X of what Japan did of the THAAD deployment in Korea. The common theme of how a country forced China to pull back from their coercion is the multilateral approach, expanding their economic opportunities, expanding their trades, relying on other partners, where China realizes they're the odd person out. They are the isolated party, and the other country has more friends, more capabilities. That is true on the economic sphere, it's true on the political sphere, and it's true on the military. When you bring multiple countries in, China then recedes backwards. And that's the Lattice Work system. So we've gone replacing a system where it's the United States bilat with Japan, the United States bilat with Korea, the United States bilat with Australia, the United States bilat with India or any other country, into multiple countries operating in multiple layers. And it's not a bilateral, but it's multiple countries. That has a weight all its own that China can't stand. And it has a level of deterrence.
A signal accomplishment of Biden administration and yourself and Ambassador Goldberg in Korea was this cooperation between Japan and the Republic of Korea, which is, for those of us who've been dealing with for years, is just amazing. But in your op-ed, you mentioned that part of the success is due to the personalities involved. And the fact that Prime Minister Kishida is gone, President Yoon may not be around much longer. Is this at risk?
Well, even the short answer is yes and no. That's there's still a lot of trilateral activities going on the security side. I do think that President Biden and all of us who worked for the Biden administration made the Japanese and the Korean leaders feel more comfortable, so they went farther, stretched beyond the bare minimum. And that was facilitating an historic meeting at Camp David. I think in the end of the day, countries may try other things, but they ultimately come back to their own national interest, self-interest. And I take one example of this. between the first impeachment part of articles against President Yoon and the second. One failed, the first one failed, the second one succeeded. What do you think was removed? Any criticism of the trilateral exercises and partnerships with Japan. That was removed. And so that spoke to, there's a commitment by the country and the people to something more and different. Now, pause, I'll come back to that. One of the arguments that Ambassador Goldberg, Phil, who's a dear friend of mine now, and I didn't know him beforehand, both him and Mary Kay, two career people, Mary Kay's in the Philippines, can't speak volumes highly enough from them, and how much I learned from them and how much I enjoyed being a partner with both of them in our different efforts. Everybody under 40, not everybody, that's a little, people under 40 in both Japan and Korea have a different attitude of the other country than their parents and grandparents. That was a generational shift, and that's only happening greater. Second, anime is the most popular foreign cultural art form in Korea, and K-pop is in Japan. Here in Japan, Phil has said the same in Korea. In front of Korean restaurants, there's lines of people here in Japan to get in. That is also true of Japanese restaurants in Korea. There's a cultural shift. There's still a politics that has a narrative around it? Yes. But the demographics of a country with certain investments by the leaders are trending in one way that's different. And in all three countries, but specifically in Japan and Korea, one of the uniting forces is China's approval is in single digits or very low teens. And so I'm not going to give another country's leaders political advice, but I'd watch myself if I got, given where the countries, I'm talking about 85%, 89% are negative about China's influence. The idea that you're going to do a set of politics that looks like you're chucking the United States or the trilat in favor of China, as we like to say in Chicago, that dog won't hunt. Just by way.
Well, Ambassador, as long as we're talking about trilaterals and bilateral with Korea, what's really been sort of fascinating from my end is I'm very involved with the Philippines, and you mentioned Ambassador Carlson. What has been going on between the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines is similarly extraordinary.
Yeah.
And I think particularly from a Philippine perspective, it has been really a lifeline.
Right.
How did all that come about? And what do you expect Japan to sort of lean into this new relationship with the Philippines?
So let me do a couple things, and I'll try to stay on track and answer each level. One, we appropriately, for a host of reasons, see political and strategic value to the United States, Japan, and Korea trilat. But part of it is historic, part of it is an emotional, and given the 30-year effort. The truth is, if you look at China has as much mercury rise in the thermometer about the U.S., Japan, Philippine trilat that we have in our thermometer because of the history of U.S., Japan, Korea, U.S., Korea relationships. And they're both of strategic equal value. But we always lose sight because it kind of just happened in the last 2 years. So, point of origin is there's a lot of coverage and a lot of attention focused as we're building towards Camp David for the trilat with Korea and Japan. And I'm talking about 9 months out. It's in the kind of bloodstream and in the news. We're at an Indo-Pacific conference, all the ambassadors from the region. And that Admiral Aspolino, and at that time the head of the Navy section, Vice Admiral Aparo, were hosting. Mary Kay Carlson and I had a scheduled breakfast. And let me say one thing, the Indo-Pacific conferences are invaluable. Usually I roll my eyes at these things, whatever. I think what they do is spectacular. I don't know another region of the part of the world where the Indo-PACOM or the military central command organizes all the ambassadors. But it's an invaluable integration of the political, diplomatic, and military. Invaluable. And maybe because of the geography, that's the only thing. So anyway, we go to breakfast, and over breakfast, Mary Kay and I said that there's a value in a trilat and whether Washington can kind of have the bandwidth for another one. Now, remember, this is 9 months prior to Camp David. I think it's the Indo-PACOM is in February at that time. So we agreed, we write a memo to the White House National Security, to Jake Sullivan, Kurt Campbell, I forgot, Secretary Blinken. I think Wendy Sherman is there at the time. Mira back at the White House. Luke at the White House. Anyway, a bunch of people. Dan, Kurt, and Green. And we propose U.S., Japan, Philippines. And it was a 3-page memo. Why the benefit, etc. And there's not usually, Washington and specifically the State Department is not exactly known for its nimbleness. Let's just say that as a character. And I'm long Secretary Blinken. He immediately in his office signed off on the concept and basically let us run without going through all the details and the machinations, etc. At an ASEAN meeting here in Tokyo, Kurt Campbell is here, and he proposes in a side meeting at the Okura Hotel that I attend with him that President Marcos comes to Washington for the first ever inaugural trilat between President Marcos, Prime Minister Kishida, and President Biden on the back end of Prime Minister Kishida's state visit. Now, he didn't, for rightful reasons, he did not want to be seen as just kind of a snap-on at the end. So what we worked out was it was a state visit. Prime Minister Kishida spent the day then traveling in North Carolina, visiting the new Toyota investment and other investments. Overnights in D.C. And then the next day in the East Wing, we had a first ever inaugurated trilateral meeting between the 3 heads of states, national security advisors, Secretary of State, I think Commerce secretaries were there, etc. We have been Japan, I think, has delivered 12 to 14 of their Coast Guard cutter class and other ships and radar material on the way to 19 Coast Guard vessels to the Philippines. The United States has done a series of other things to aid and assist on the Luzon corridor from an economic investment standpoint, both the port, the airport, the rail tracks, etc., for the economic development that President Marcos wants to see. There was also an investment in semiconductor education and training for the Philippines. I'm going to forget. There's some other component on the economic front. But anyway, that's the bulk of it. And I think now, if I'm not mistaken, I've seen President Marcos is looking at refiling the 2016 maritime case, protecting the islands and the EEZ and the definition of the Philippine EEZ. And obviously, as we were last time, the United States and Japan will be supportive of that effort because the law and international maritime law is quite clear. There's not a lot of ambiguity there. So it's really become a value, and it started, not that other people weren't talking about it, but on this one, Mary Kay and I made a proposal, and other people quickly, Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, and the people who worked for him grabbed it, and it like a hot knife through butter. The system actually turned around.
It's great when the plan comes together.
It's not only when it comes together, is when people back in Washington, not invented here, so they put a knife in it and they kill it. And it is an example where I do, as somebody who's known for their criticism of the State Department's suffocation. This is an example where they allowed an initiative and two entrepreneurial ambassadors. And Mary Kate, she was I just have the greatest admiration for both her and Phil of kind of pushing these ideas, and have been on the front lines of both the security and political transformation, and kind of executing on the idea of anchoring the United States deeper. So China's strategy is checkmate in the region, which is to be such a dominant power they can dictate to every other country in the region whether they have X amount of sovereignty or X amount of independence.
I'd say the one area where we haven't been able to push back on China is China as this leading trade partner of these countries. And the U.S. has not really stepped up much on that, would you say?
Yeah.
Is there more we could have done?
Yes. So let me try to, I don't totally disagree with you, but let me just do a couple bigger than footnote disagreements, or at least lay out a different way of thinking about this. And it's the integration of our economic statecraft into our political and security statecraft, into a comprehensive theory of the case. Now, I think the multilateralism, the lattice work that you talked about, beyond having its own logic, really accelerated because of China's mistake on both wolf warrior and belligerence on other countries, whether that's India's border, strafing Australian planes, Senkaku Islands in Japan, just blah, 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 blah. You can see there's not a country in the region they're not belligerently it was an opening that the United States filled and advanced the ball dramatically. I believe China's economic coercion, and more importantly, their economic mercantilism, will create on the economic sphere as much opportunity for the United States as Wolf Warrior did on the diplomatic side. I mean, you're just not going to have a case where China now destroyed Chile's only steel plant and 20,000 people lost a job. I think we can all agree Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, a little warmer to China than they are to us. They all filed WTO cases against China. Why? Because basically the PRC leadership, and specifically President Xi, have made a decision they are going to export their domestic economic problems to every other country. And it's your job to swallow and chew it. That is what they're saying. I mean, the United States has to be nimble enough to create a strategy, not just to keep our friends like Japan close, but to keep the door open for the Vietnams, the Indonesias, the other countries that not only in this region but around the world, who do not want their economy and their industrial base to fall victim to China's mercantilism. Now, we have to start thinking of our energy less as a resource and more as a strategic asset. Now, we're one of the largest LNG exporters to China. But huge opportunity, not only here in Japan, we're the fourth or fifth LNG exporter, but that's also South Korea. We are now developing SMR technology. Japan's geothermal is a huge opportunity for hydraulic type of engineering that we're experts in now. I mean, you can go through this on coastal wind development. You can go through it on SMR, as I said, nuclear technology. You can go through it on the battery type of storage, etc. Our energy is part of our statecraft of bringing countries closer in to economic opportunities with the United States. Our market access is only one component of that economic statecraft. And if all we do is reduce our economic statecraft to trade, everybody goes into Braveheart paint. They paint their faces blue, yellow, and green, and we'll never have a discussion. We got to be honest. Last 30 years where every trade deal was blessed as great was not true. And we also got to be honest that every trade deal is horrible is also not true. There's a more nimble approach to understanding the cost-benefit analysis of trade, both at home and abroad, understanding how to negotiate something that is favorable to the United States' industrial interests and manufacturing interests and economic capabilities. And it's not just about market access to the United States. And it's now, as an avid reader of history, the creation of NATO, the creation of the Marshall Plan, The creation of kind of economic trade, etc., was not on a Tuesday at 9 o'clock. It happened over many, many months and years where a coherence was developed. And I think we're in the middle of that process.
I have to ask you about, Ambassador, I have to ask you about Taiwan, and to what extent there's a couple different goggles to look at Taiwan from, especially from a Japanese perspective. And one might be, this is potentially a huge, crisis that we could be dragged into. Another is Taiwan is crucial to Japanese security, and we can't let China, occupy this strategic space. What view in your mind, or pick off the menu, if you will, what view is the Japanese view of the Taiwan problem?
Well, I want to be careful that I'm not speaking for the Japanese. So
Sure.
I think the better way to look at it is, which is also an example of the alliance strength. As you know, every administration produces a set of national security documents at the beginning of their administration that are kind of their guiding lights. Early when I get here, while we are rewriting our national security documents and producing them, it's interesting that Japan also rewrote their 3 national security documents, and they were unbelievably complementary in seeing the region the same way, the prioritization the same way. I'm not saying that we could write theirs and they could write ours, but pretty close. And the interesting thing is, also around the same time, South Korea writes their national security documents. Very complementary in the view of the world, very complementary in distribution of resources, etc. And obviously the Korean Peninsula is a little more, is different than the Senkaku Islands, etc. And so I think the best way for me to answer is just look at their documents and look at how they reorient their worries from a northern Hokkaido Island view of the world, that is Japan, to a more Southwest Islands, Sea of Japan concern, and the islands that are there. And they realize that obviously, given the amount of economic cargo and that goes through not only the South China Sea, but through the Taiwan Straits, they have a vested self-interest. And especially given a country, I mean, if something was to happen at Taiwan, I mean, with the amount of trade and the amount of behavior by China of using economic coercion to coerce another country to bend them to their will, that's not exactly a corridor of water that I would want to freely give away. So you just got to look at it. Their documents speak for themselves, and they don't need my interpretation.
So where does this relationship go from here? Do we have Six Eyes intelligence sharing? Do we have Japan joining AUKUS? Well, where can we take it?
Japan is already, I mean, that's part of the state visit was, AUKUS too. And we've got to be part of AUKUS. AUKUS 1 has to execute. That gets me into my biggest pet peeve, which is the U.S. military industrial base and the U.S. military industrial companies, who I think have been derelict in buying stock while they haven't been able to meet a budget or a deadline. I just consider the big five the most derelict out of never, and we're all responsible. We literally, all of us, and I've been on both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue, Democrats and Republicans, we're all guilty, so therefore we all have to fix it. I'm not interested in how we got here, but the idea that companies are buying stock in billions and billions of dollars and there's not a single major weapon that they've either produced on time or produced on budget, ever. Then, classic example, last 10 years, we've allocated the resources for 2 nuclear subs, and 1.2 have been built each year. They've never hit it. And then they ask for another $15 billion because they're over budget and a decade behind. And we have this AUKUS membership. So now I got that off my chest to the core part of your question. Look, one of the things I think is, and it has a slight edge to it, but I think we're stronger not just because we have allies and China doesn't. I think we're stronger because when our allies have the confidence to go, they can do things in the region we can't do. reference point, example, when it came to the vote in March of 2022 to condemn Russia, Japan on their own got on the phone with the Asiatic countries, and 8 out of the 10 Asiatic countries voted against Russia and their war in Ukraine. 4 of the 8 co-sponsored the resolution. Now, do we deliver metal? Yeah. But Japan delivers a lot of diplomatic capital and development capital. They're one of the biggest investors in the region from a pure economic development standpoint. I think it's $300 billion, way over China. They bring assets to this relation. Now, I think we're at a period of time going from alliance protection to alliance projection into the region. But if the United States thinks they're going to go solo in this act, great. Try your deterrence out of Long Beach, California. So you can either do it here in Japan, in Korea, Australia, Perth in Australia, Singapore, the Philippines, Subic Bay, or you can do it from Long Beach, California. It's a lot of distance. It's not just allies make us stronger and, we all sing Kumbaya. It's a geographic fact. It's not a land exercise. This is a naval, water, aerial exercise. And the capacity to have allies in the country that ground us in the country that make our deterrence to China credible. Without allies, our deterrence is not as credible. I can't make it simpler. And if you treat your allies with the same irreverence that you treat your adversary, and I know I'm not so people, you shouldn't call China, I don't know, China an adversary. China decided in 2012 we were no longer strategic competitors, we were strategic adversaries. Our allies level up the playing field for us. Now, I want to be honest, I don't think I fully appreciated that in January 2022 when I got here. I walk away on the road to Damascus, I've been converted. It's taking another region of the world in Damascus. I didn't mean Damascus because it's in the news, but it's just a fact. And we're just if part of the strategy, and I don't like the Cold War metaphor for a host of inaccuracies to it, but if the goal is deterrence and the deterrence to be perceived credible, you're not doing it from Long Beach, California.
Well, Ambassador, you brought up the Cold War, so we're going to get you out of here talking about a Cold War reference you had, again, from your Washington Post op-ed, which is the long telegram from George Kennan. As you said that if he's known for the long telegram, you would be known for short tweets.
Come on, that was pretty...
Why did you decide to communicate that way?
That was kind of pithy. I'm actually...
Okay, well, you didn't use the word pithy, but we'll accept it. What made you decide to use tweets as a means of communication? And what do you think? Where do you think you're?
It's back to my pet peeve about the state. Look, we're in a digital age, and the State Department's barely in the analog age. You can't run a process now. I don't think you could have every ambassador run free range, but you got to be able to be in real time, say something that people remember. Because let me say, talking points are exactly what they're supposed to be. So nobody remembers a thing you said. It is literally vanilla. And if you want to exist in the political domain, in the public space, and occupy it, you got to have the capacity, and social media gives you in real time a capacity to say something that's memorable. Second, a lot of my social media was in defense of Japan that was victim of China's coercion. Fukushima, they literally said, the water's not safe. They're fishing in the Japan's waters, but ban Japanese fish. I'm sorry. Maybe you should have it. Maybe you should. We leave it to the diplomatic dialogues. No, I'm going to call out hypocrisy when I see it. Okay. Last 2 months ago, in a period of 1 week, China's plane veered off, a spy plane, and China's spy boats veered off into Japan EEZ. Now, should I have been silent about it? Everybody else was silent. And if you think that's a coincidence, then try Google Map. It really works, but you'd have to obviously take down, the wall that prevents you from accessing. But China, and then they walk around saying we just want a good neighbor policy. So I decided I was going to call out the hypocrisy when I saw it, specifically for Japan, but I veered off and here they are. They got 400 nuclear weapons, and for weeks you don't know where the Secretary of Defense, their Minister of Defense is. That's not a responsible world leader that always walks around and says, well, we want to be a responsible world leader respected as a superpower. Well, you can't. Your Minister of Defense can't go missing. Okay?
Well,
That's why I did it. And let me say that
we're going to miss the
and you remembered it. And as did the Chinese Foreign Ministry that had to respond to it a couple times. Okay? Go, shot on goal.
All right, so I have to ask you this.
All right, I got to leave going. You get last question.
All right,
I got this.
last question. Just you're in Washington, the heart of the White House and Congress. What has surprised you about being an ambassador? What did you expect? What was really different?
I don't know if I had any. I would say I had any. Well, let me say. I suppose it gets to the core of the. I hate that we referenced it, but this Washington Post piece. Everybody it really is in hushed tones. An ambassador is, wearing a gray flannel suit, double-breasted, pipe smoking, talking in hushed tones. It's politics. James Baker wrote a book called The Politics of Diplomacy. He didn't write about it, and everybody wants you to think that diplomacy, and you got to know your book of business. You have to understand the history. You got to understand the culture. You have to have an appreciation for those things. But if you build trust with people, you try to understand their position, and then not only get caught trying to understand their position, but then how to communicate to it, etc. You can usually understand diplomacy or talk, and also a lot of the Japan experts, and that's not a criticism of them, thought there was a tempo, and during COVID, they missed the new Japan emerging post-COVID, a more energetic, more focused, more determined Japan than what people have seen in the last 20 or 30 years. And I don't know. It's I would say our presumptions have to be scrubbed, both about the speed in which Japan is willing to do things, their willingness to execute on things, and also understanding that diplomacy most effectively is done when you get politics. Trust me, anything going on in the Mideast today, if you're naive to politics, now again, there's a history, there's example, etc. You got to be sensitive to the individual country. If you don't get politics, you can't execute. I don't care where you are in the world.
Well, sir, thank you for your time. It's been a true honor, and thank you for your service in Japan.
Okay.
And we do wish you a very, very happy retirement or whatever is next.
Well, retirement doesn't come easy, so forget about it. But happy and healthy here to you and your families.
Wow, Jim, what a way to start 2025. That was a great, great interview with a very plain-spoken ambassador, somebody who obviously has been speaking in the public space for quite a long time and was known in Japan and around the region for being an ambassador who spoke his mind.
Well, he has that reputation coming in, and that leopard didn't change his spots.
No.
Which brings up the question. He clearly cares a lot about the alliance and relationship, sees the value to the United States of the reliance of the alliance and the deterrence effect of the lattice work that's been created. So the question is, of course, we have a new administration coming in. He's out of the job in Japan as of January 20th. What comes next?
Yeah. Well, so for the most part, I think that below the level of the president himself during the first Trump administration, we actually had a lot of, pro-alliance people in key positions. And we've seen people nominated by the Trump administration or to be part of the Trump administration who seem to be generally pro-alliance and particularly hawkish on China and pro-Indo-Pacific. One thing that I remember from our interview with the designee, the Trump administration's nominee for Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Elbridge Colby, was he was pretty dismissive of the value of assurance as part of the language of diplomacy, and actually thought that we overused assurance, leading our allies kind of down the wrong road, or maybe a primrose path, over promising on things. And that's not the song that Ambassador Emanuel.
Well, I disagree, because he said they rely too much on us.
Right.
So I would say there's some overlap there.
Yeah.
In their view.
Yeah. But I mean, as I was reading the ambassador's comments here in his op-ed, he said, let's see, we have spent the past 3 years reassuring our friends in the region that the United States is a permanent Pacific power and presence that they can bet long on us. And that is what assurance is, right? That's essentially what, when we worked in a country that was a U.S. ally, we wanted them to buy into that as well. We didn't want them to sort of hedge their bets and start making side deals, on the assumption that the U.S. wasn't going to be around.
Right. But the expectation now from all parties is they have to pull their weight more.
Yeah. Well, and I think, and he even indicated, that's actually healthy, right? They do need to pull their weight. Right. And Japan has been pulling its weight. And that's what I think is really, we've heard this from other guests. That is actually one of the most exciting things that's happened in U.S. security in recent years, has been this growing, vibrant partnership, alliance partnership with Japan, a very serious Japan, a very focused Japan, and a Japan that's willing to put real resources behind its commitment to mutual security.
Right. But the risk I see is that we are having our economic and trade policy now as part of it, our overall relationship. And does this mean tariffs are going to be applied, and we don't expect that to impact the security relationship? Are we going to allow Nippon Steel to buy U.S. steel, and that won't have, or not?
Right.
To me, as Ambassador Emanuel said, we have a more integrated economic and security diplomacy and policy. If that's the case, we have to think about how these economic decisions impact the other side of the equation.
Yeah. So I actually had told you that I was going to tell you a particular story today, or there I was story about my time in Japan when I was in Okinawa back in the 90s. But I'm going to pull a switch here, because what you just said reminded me of something else I've been thinking about in terms of the tendency of diplomats versus, this other idea that you've got to be very confrontational with our allies and partners. And I remember I went through an exercise in Command and General Staff College back in 2005, where we went through a negotiation, and we were trying to identify through the negotiation who the negotiation stabilizers were and who the destabilizers were. And so we basically had a role play, and they didn't ask us these questions until after the role play. So this was like a role play in the middle of Afghanistan where we're trying to sit down with tribal leaders and such. And so afterwards, it turned out that I was everybody pointed at me as being the person who was always the stabilizer, who was always trying to find the common ground. Okay, what you just said was this, what you said was this, and what we could all agree on is this. It was always sort of trying to push things forward. And then there was another guy in the class who was clearly the destabilizer, and he would sort of throw these grenades out there. And one of the conclusions we came up to is you really do kind of have to have both, right? The problem with the stabilizers of the world, myself included, is that we don't drive a very hard bargain, right? Yes, that's why my wife doesn't want me to go with her when she goes to buy a car. It's because she'll look at me and she'll go, I don't know, what do you think? I don't know, because it looks great. And so, why did I bring you? So I think there is a play, and obviously, President-elect Trump is clearly a destabilizer in negotiations. I mean, that's his style. And so then you go to try to figure out, the question is, how much of that is negotiating bluster and how much of that is actually something that he feels strongly about and is going to push that through. And sometimes you can't really tell.
Well, you can't tell. That's his negotiating leverage. But the risk is if they think, oh, it's all bluff,
Right.
you have misunderstandings that can rise suddenly. And it's a dangerous game, bottom line.
Spoken like a true stabilizer.
I can't help myself.
All right, Jim. Well, this was a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to 2025. I do want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Bauer Group Asia, and the work that they do in Asia in terms of helping companies to do business in Asia. I think is something that we look forward to learning more about as we talk to some of our guests and we've talked to some of them already. And we really appreciate the way that they've come on board because they see the value in getting people to understand the Indo-Pacific. So we appreciate them coming on board and being part of this endeavor.
Sounds good, Ray. Have a good 2025.
All right. Well, okay. So on our way out, we got to make sure that we remind people if they are sitting there staring at their YouTube right now, thinking, what else should I do before I click out of this? Because Ray is clearly into his outro now, and I don't want to listen to any more of this. Fine, but hit that little like and subscribe button right down at the bottom so that you can help us out and get a lot more people. Thanks again to our producer, Ian Ellis Jones. Follow him on X at Ian Ellis Jones. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you know that we can also follow us on X at IndoPac Podcast. If you're listening to us in your ears and you're not seeing our faces, you can go to youtube.com at IP Podcasts. And if you have a specific question for us, email us. Yes, indeed, we have an email, IndoPacificPodcast@gmail.com. And finally, if you like us on LinkedIn, just go search for our name. That's Jim. I'm Ray. He's Ian, but you can't see him. Thanks for joining us. Happy 2025 on Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific?